Okay, hello everybody. All right, hopefully you've already watched the first subsection for this module, which was about Northern Europe in the early Renaissance. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Renaissance in 15th century Italy. So some of the things that are happening to lead up to this. Humanism, which had kind of started in the previous century being a popular thing, fully blossoms in the 15th century. The tenets of humanism are an emphasis on education, expanding knowledge in general, but also particularly studying classical antiquity and literature, so like the Greeks and the Romans, what they wrote about, what their art looked like, that kind of thing, their philosophy. Also exploring individual potential, so looking at what people as individuals can do and can contribute in their communities, part of humanism, civic responsibility, and moral duty. So these are kind of the tenets of humanism, which becomes a very popular stance and movement in this time period. There's also a lot of artistic talent. This is kind of when artistic genius and innovation becomes big. So we have humanism, we have artistic talent, and we have a lot of prosperity from our developing nobility and merchant classes. So those three things come together to kind of give birth to the Renaissance. So this is how we get into this. For Italians, because we're going to be talking about Italy in this lecture, the interest in Plato, Aristotle, and Ovid was really big, so that classic antiquity and literature. They start to develop, so there's different dialects within Italy. It's not everyone speaking Italian at this time, so there's a Tuscan dialect. Tuscany is the region that Florence is in, which is where the Medicis are. Very wealthy area in this time. So they develop a written Tuscan dialect of writing. So words and literature and information are able to be shared with a larger audience. We also, last time I mentioned that movable type, the printing press, is invented by Gutenberg. So this makes it much, much easier and cheaper and quicker to reproduce books. They don't have to be done by hand anymore. So more people are able to have access to more literature and information at this time. One of the first bestsellers in Italy is Dante's Divine Comedy, which you may be at least sort of familiar with. You maybe know who Dante is. So that's reproduced everywhere at this time and is very popular. Okay, so the first guy we're going to talk about is Lorenzo Ghiberti. Lorenzo Ghiberti is most famous for creating these doors. So we're going to talk about them. So he's one of the first artists to use a scientific system of representing space. So in looking back at classical antiquity, the Greeks understood space and they understood things like perspective. But in the Middle Ages, this all kind of gets forgotten. And basically the aesthetic thinks that this is not, that a naturalistic, realistic way to portray things is not appropriate and is kind of insolent. So people stop doing it and kind of forget how to do it. An architect who's a contemporary of Ghiberti is Brunelleschi. So he kind of writes about how to use a scientific method of linear perspective that Ghiberti was definitely familiar with. They were actually rivals for the competition to make these doors. These doors were made for the baptistry. So there's the Duomo, which is the big cathedral in the middle, the big church in the middle of Florence. And then across from it in the same piazza is the baptistry where people were baptized. And so they had this competition to make these doors. Excuse me. Ghiberti obviously wins. He beats Brunelleschi. Then he uses Brunelleschi's methodology to incorporate perspective into his doors. Okay, so perspective illusion is a big deal. He's commissioned to make the doors for the Florence Baptistry in 1425. These are the east doors, so they're the ones that directly face the doors of the Duomo. The Duomo is the church. Later, Michelangelo described these doors as so beautiful they would do well for the gates of paradise. So that's where we get the title of them as the gates of paradise. That's not what they were known as when they were made at the time. It was Michelangelo later talking about them that created that title. Each of the panels depicts a scene from the Old Testament. They are done in relief, as you can see. And if you look at each of them, you can see that the relief, or how in the round, how fully developed a sculpture they are, increases the closer the figure is to the foreground and decreases the further they go back. So this is using sculptural figuration as well as linear perspective to show depth in this portrayal, which is very innovative. No one had done anything like this since the ancient Greeks. Okay, so those are the most important things about this. It's very popular. They're considered very beautiful. It's a mastery of achievement. The panel above I picked as the story of Jacob and Esau, but you can see they're all panels from the Old Testament. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the influence of classicism, of antiquity, of the Greeks and the Romans in our culture. So one of the big things, as I said, was the use of perspective. So that's something that comes from the revival of classical techniques. Another one is freestanding nude sculptures. So in Greek and Roman culture, nude sculptures were kind of all the rage. There were a lot of them. In the Middle Ages and medieval times, the clergy decided that this was bad, that you should not have naked people standing around. This was not cool. So that stopped. So we stopped having nude figures in the round. Donatello, who is the artist who made this piece, is the first one to kind of bring it back and repopularize it and revive it in the Renaissance. Donatello, also of Ninja Turtle fame, is a very popular sculptor at the time. He's quite famous. He lives in Florence. This particular sculpture was made for the Medicis, the wealthy bankers who are big-time patrons. As I said, we'll be mentioning them a lot. So this piece was made for them sometime between 1440 and 1460. We don't know the exact date that it was cast. It is cast bronze. Okay, so the other reason that David is important and makes sense as a subject matter, and we see portrayals of David quite a lot in this area, is because David kind of became the chosen symbol of the city of Florence. And the city of Florence is where the Medicis lives. The Medicis, who are the patrons who pay for and commission a lot of the art, really like David because he's kind of their symbol. If you're not familiar with David, he is a character from the Bible. He was a smaller youth, and he defeated the giant Goliath. So the idea is that Florence as a city-state is smaller than some of the other areas, but it's a big power because of their banking, because of the Medicis. So it made sense as their symbol. So the Florentine Republic takes on David kind of as their guy, and we see a rise in the popularity of David as subject matter. Okay. This is Fra Filippo Lippi. He was a friar, like another famous painter that one of you is writing about, Fra Angelico. So one of you in the discussions will write about Fra Angelico, who was a very holy, kind of a good religious clergy type. Fra Filippo Lippi was not suited for the clergy. He was a criminal. He committed a lot of crimes. He committed forgery. He embezzled a bunch of money from the church. And most notably, he abducted a very pretty nun. He abducted her, made her his mistress. They eventually fall in love and stay together, and they have a child. Their child is Filippino Lippi, who is also a famous painter and is the son of Filippo Lippi. Thus his name, Filippino, is a diminutive. It's kind of like being named Junior, basically. Okay, so he's not very good at being a friar, so he stops doing that and becomes a painter. The Medici were his big patrons. They intervened. The council of the church wanted to smite him. They wanted to punish him very badly. But the Medicis were like, we think he's a pretty good painter, so don't punish him too severely. We'd like to keep him around in our court to do paintings for us. So his painting skill kind of got him off from his punishment. Okay, so he's important for several reasons. First of all, I think his paintings are just gorgeous. I love this painting. I think it's extremely beautiful. It's, if you're ever in Florence, it's in the Uffizi Gallery, which is it's maybe the most wonderful collection of Renaissance paintings in the world. So he develops this linear style which he's probably influenced, he's almost certainly influenced by Ghiberti and Donatello and their look at classical perspective and the ideas about line. You can see that he incorporates linear perspective to an extent. You can see the shadow behind Mary cast on the wall there that indicates, depth of space. And he has an idea about modeling. Again, modeling is when we use value to show depth. But he's not as interested in realism and the mathematic portrayal of perspective as he is. So he's not as interested in space as he is in line. So you can see this really linear quality. He has very expressive lines in his work. Also, so the contours of his figures are very emphasized. His treatment of draperies is very beautiful and very kind of expressive and implies movement in a lot of his work. His interest is much more in line than space. Okay, Lucretia, that's the name of the nun that he kidnapped and then they fell in love and had a kid. Lucretia was his model a lot of the time. This is most likely a portrait of her. This is important because he was one of the earliest painters in the Renaissance to consistently use live models for his work. So he did a lot of sketching from life, but he also painted from life. So a lot of the flesh tones and the tones of color and the draperies and the use of shadow are from life, and so they're a little bit more realistic, even though that wasn't his primary interest. The other thing about him that I really like is if you look at the expressions on the faces, they're not solemn. A lot of religious painting up to this point, everyone's very, very solemn looking, right? So if you look at their expressions, I mean, it's very tender, it's kind of happy, and then you look at the angel in the corner and he just looks very mischievous, like he's like kind of a troublemaker, which is also very interesting. This is the influence of humanism at the time, which comes in and makes individualized paintings and individualized characteristics popular in portrayal of holy people like the Virgin Mary. Okay, Sandro Botticelli, one of you is going to write about his most famous painting, which is The Birth of Venus. You've maybe seen it, so we'll learn about that in our discussions. I think that's the only Botticelli I assigned in the discussion this time. Okay, so let's talk about Botticelli. He is one of my favorite painters from this period. This is his painting Primavera. If you have taken Italian, you know Primavera means spring. So this is a portrayal of spring. Botticelli, he's kind of known for being the most preeminent painter of mythology of the time. He also was patronized by the Medici family. They really liked him, and he did a lot of paintings of mythological subject matter for them. This particular painting is set in an orange grove. The word for orange is mela medica in Italian, which means medicinal apples. The name Medici means doctor, so he put this in an orange grove as like a nod to his patrons. He painted this before his most famous painting, which is The Birth of Venus, which we'll learn about later. Venus is also the central figure in this painting. Her son Cupid is above her head. To her right, which is our left, we see the three Graces dancing. On our right, the blue, ice-cold Zephyrus is about to carry off and marry she's not Floris yet, Chloris, which you can see the flowers, the plants coming out of her mouth. After he carries her off and marries her, he transforms her into Flora, who's the goddess of spring. So that woman in the floral gown in front of the woman with the flowers coming out of her mouth is actually the same woman. After she is married to Zephyrus, she becomes Flora. Okay, so that's kind of a confusing part of this painting. In the far left, we see Mercury with his staff. The caduceus is his staff, which he uses to influence the weather. He's maybe dispersing thunderclouds right now, so it will stay a beautiful spring day. The occasion for the painting is probably a wedding because of all the springtime and the happiness and the Venus and the Cupid and the love. At the time, the intersection of humanism and Christianity led to a lot of paintings in mythology that are supposed to allude to Christian values. So this being Venus being love in the center, the idea is if you read it right to left, it sends the message to the newlyweds to seek God through love. So the idea is that love can be lust and violence, like with Zephyrus and Chloris, or it can be reason and faith, which Mercury is a symbol of. So the idea of this is to send a message to the newlyweds about love and godliness and humanism and virtue and things like this. Okay, so Botticelli is very removed from the scientific techniques of the time. He doesn't care that much about perspective. I mean, he has some perspective, but he's not that interested in it. He doesn't really care how the body actually looks in terms of naturalistic. He's much more interested in making elegant, beautiful lines. I mean, if you look at Venus, she has sort of this S shape to her body. It sort of looks like both her shoulders are dislocated. If you really think about it, that's not really how shoulders work. Everything is very like relaxed and beautiful and lovely, but it doesn't structurally make a lot of sense. So he's much more interested in beauty and aesthetics than he is in the scientific aspects of painting. Okay, next slide. Giovanni Bellini. So Giovanni Bellini is he's very prominent at the time. So a lot of what we've been talking about takes place in Florence. Bellini is kind of the guy in Venice. So in the 16th century, Venice kind of emerges as one of the three great centers of the Renaissance. So Florence, Rome, Venice. So Bellini's like the big guy, the famous painter in Venice. Okay, so Bellini has a lot of historical training in the Gothic arts. His father was a Gothic painter, but he kind of breaks away from that and becomes more interested in Renaissance style painting. He's credited with establishing basically like the Venetian high Renaissance school of painting. So a school of painting isn't exactly a literal school, it's more like a classification of painting. So there are a lot of artists who do this Venetian style, which is kind of after Bellini. This is his most famous work from this period. He sticks around for a while and is quite popular for many years. So this is St. Francis in the desert. So St. Francis is the founder of the Franciscan order, one of the major orders of monks. If you look at his desk, there is a skull on it. That's a nod to the crucifixion and to the death of Christ. If you look at his hands, you can see the stigmata. That is St. Francis's attribute. He received the stigmata, which is the markings of the crucifixion. You can also see that he's looking up to the golden light. That's supposed to symbolize God's presence. There's water trickling out of the rocks he's standing on. That's a reference to when Moses strikes a rock and a spring comes forth. A lot of people in the Renaissance kind of viewed St. Francis as the new Moses, like the New Testament, post-New Testament Moses, basically. There's a donkey in the background. The donkey symbolizes patience. And you can see that in the background, though this is Francis in the wilderness, you can see the Italian medieval style town in the background. So it's kind of still grounding it in a familiar setting for the people of the time. Okay, it's also interesting in its technique. It's painted with a mix of oil and tempera. So the two major paint types of the time are mixed together. That's a very Venetian thing. That's kind of what the artists of Venice did. So you have the rich jewel tones of tempera, but you also have the layering techniques of oil. Okay. The next slide, which is the last one we're going to talk about in this period, is taking us to Urbino. So Urbino is southeast of Florence, and it is another kind of important area during the Renaissance, and it becomes important under this guy who's portrayed in this painting, Duke Federico di Montefeltro. So the whole painting is a double portrait. You can see it in the upper corner here, and it's by the artist Piero della Francesca. So he's one of the Duke's favorite artists. He receives quite a few commissions from the Duke. He comes and paints in his court. This is one of the more famous of his commissions. So it's a double portrait. It's of the Duke and his second wife, whose name was Battista. And he married her when she was only 14 in 1460. She was very well educated in humanism and humanistic values. She was an excellent administrator of his territories while he was away on various frequent military campaigns. He's a really famous military guy. People were sent from all over Europe to train under him. The two of them had 8 daughters and finally a son, which they wanted a son for an heir. They had those 9 children over a short time period of 11 years. She died of pneumonia like 5 months after their last child, their son, was born. And he kind of mourned her for the rest of his life. He was very sad. He loved her very much, and she was very important. He had this painting commissioned after she died. Sorry for the noise in the background. That is, I'm recording this at home, so that is people, my family. So he mourned her for the rest of his life. She dies of pneumonia. She's only 26 when she dies. It's very sad. The painting was done after her death. So the reference to her face is probably done from her death mask, which is why her face is much less detailed than his face. How pale she is might also be a reference to the fact that she is dead. You can see the rich detail in her hair ornament and in her clothing, so it's not like for a lack of ability to portray detail. The reason this is done in profile is because he lost his eye and most of his nose in a tournament, so his face was very disfigured. So all portrayals of him at this time are from this side and this angle. Okay, so that is Piero della Francesca, and our second subsection under Renaissance and Baroque. Don't forget to make your discussion comments and to make your introduction post, and make sure you don't forget to do your quiz. Okay, bye.